All right, listeners, ready for a trip back in time? We're going to 1989, Britain, big hair, shoulder pads, and a pretty radical shift in their economy.
It was the era of Thatcherism privatization was the name of the game.
Exactly, and we're diving into a fascinating document from that time, the original prospectus for South West Water's public stock offering. Think of it as their sales pitch for why you should buy a piece of a water company.
It's like a time capsule, a window into how they tried to convince people that private companies could handle something as essential as water.
Yeah, because water's not like choosing a different brand of cereal or something, right? It's a necessity.
You got it. And that's what makes this prospectus so intriguing. They had to make a compelling case, especially in a region like Southwest England. We're talking Devon, Cornwall, picture-stunning coastlines, quaint villages, and, oh yeah, a ton of tourists.
Lots of demand for water then. So was Southwest Water a brand new thing in '89?
No, they weren't a startup or anything. They were actually formed back in 1974. And get this, they were the result of merging like 89 local water and sewerage bodies.
89.
Yeah, 89. Can you imagine the
Oh,
paperwork?
my head's spinning just thinking about it.
And on top of that, the region's population was booming, growing something like 6 times faster than the rest of England and Wales.
Whoa, so they had a lot on their plate already.
Oh, yeah.
Aging infrastructure, probably from all those different local bodies and this huge population growth. So was that where this whole privatization argument came in? Like they needed more money to keep up?
That's the story they're selling in this prospectus. They paint this picture of a system struggling to keep pace with all the demands, and that private ownership would bring in the investment they desperately needed. They even had a fancy name for it, the K Investment Program.
Catchy.
Right. And it wasn't small potatoes either. We're talking 1.29 billion pounds spread over a decade.
Billion with a B.
Yeah, they were going all in.
Okay, so what were they going to do with all that money, like specifically?
Think massive infrastructure overhaul, water treatment plants, all those pipes that bring water to your home, sewage treatment, even those systems that send treated wastewater out to sea. It was a top-to-bottom plan.
Makes sense. But wasn't there a lot of concern back then about water quality and pollution? Like this was around the time when environmental awareness was really taking off, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That was a hot-button issue, and the prospectus addresses it head-on.
Okay.
They go on and on about how they'll meet all these new, tougher regulations. They're going to be like the poster child for responsible water management. It almost feels like they're trying to preempt any worries, saying, look, we're the good guys, we care about the environment, and we got the cash to prove it.
Right. Right. But like with any good sales pitch, there's always the fine print to consider, right?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head.
So what kind of fine print are we talking about here?
Well, they boast about their financial performance, claiming a 41% increase in turnover over the previous 5 years.
Not bad.
Right. But then comes the interesting part.
Lay it on me.
They're basically starting with a clean slate financially. All their pre-privatization debt, poof, gone.
Seriously. Like wiped away.
Written off by the government.
Wow. That's quite a benefit. I mean, other companies don't get that kind of deal, do they?
It's definitely a unique situation, and it makes you wonder if it was a completely level playing field for everyone involved. Plus, on top of that, they were getting a big chunk of cash from the government, nearly 266 million pounds.
So debt-free, pockets full of cash, ready to invest billions. That sounds like a pretty sweet setup for them.
It does, doesn't it? But you have to wonder how all this would impact customers in the long run.
Yeah. Did they talk about that in the prospectus?
Of course, they emphasize their commitment to affordable water services. But, you can't help but wonder how that promise would hold up once they had to answer to shareholders, not just the public.
Right. Priorities can change. So we've got the big picture here. Privatization is the solution to aging infrastructure and a region that's bursting at the seams. But who were the people behind this massive shift? Were they water experts, or did they bring in some high-powered business types to shake things up?
Well, the prospectus gives us a glimpse into their leadership team, and it's interesting. At the top, you had the executive chairman, someone with experience at companies like Ford and Blue Circle.
Ford, as in cars?
The very same. It's like they were signaling, hey, we're bringing in the big guns here.
I see. But was there any pushback to that? Like, were people worried that bringing in someone from outside the water industry might mean overlooking some important local knowledge?
Oh, for sure. You got to remember there was a lot of skepticism around privatization at that time, and bringing in people from outside the industry was definitely seen as a gamble.
So they had this Ford executive running the show, but did they at least have someone with actual water expertise on board?
Of course they did. The managing director had a solid engineering background, so they had that technical side covered. And the board was a mix of executive and non-executive directors with a diverse range of expertise. They were trying to project that image of competence and stability, something that would appeal to investors.
Right, makes sense. But it wasn't just about the investors, right? They also had to think about the employees who were going through a huge change, shifting from public to private sector employment.
Exactly.
So how did the prospectus address that human side of the story?
They highlighted the employee share schemes that were designed to give staff a piece of the pie and incentivize them during the transition.
Right.
It was a tricky balance they had to strike, appealing to investors with promises of efficiency and growth while reassuring employees that they wouldn't be left behind in this whole new world of privatized water.
I can see that. Okay, so they're tackling the financial side, the infrastructure, the people. But water wasn't the only thing on their minds. The prospectus kind of hints at some other business ventures they were considering, right?
Oh, you're picking up on that. You're right. It's like they were thinking beyond just pipes and treatment plants.
So spill it. What kind of ventures were they cooking out?
Well, one area they were eyeing was developing recreational facilities around those big reservoirs. Imagine sailing, fishing, maybe even windsurfing. They were essentially looking to turn those essential resources into profit centers by tapping into a growing leisure and tourism market.
Not just delivering water, but creating a whole experience around it. Clever.
Right.
But it wasn't just about attracting tourists, was it? They also had plans for property development.
That's right. And this is where it gets really interesting. They specifically mention a joint venture with a private developer to build office space in Exeter near their headquarters. So it seems like they were aiming to attract businesses to the region, envisioning South West Water as playing a broader role in the local economy.
So branching out into leisure, property, what else? There was something about scientific and technical services too, wasn't there?
Ah, yes, this is where they try to showcase their innovative side. They were developing new process control instruments, partnered with a company called Analac. They even had patents pending. It's like they were trying to position themselves as more than just a water company, but a player in the tech world as well.
So they're painting this picture of a company on the move, eager to embrace all the opportunities of the private sector. But this was all happening under the watchful eye of a brand new regulatory regime, right? The Water Act of 1989.
Absolutely, and that's where the stakes get even higher.
So they've got all these grand plans, but they're also stepping into this whole new world of regulations with the Water Act of 1989. I mean, was everyone convinced that a private company would play by the rules? Were people worried about them cutting corners to boost profits?
Oh yeah, that was a massive concern. People were skeptical, especially when it comes to something as essential as clean water.
Right.
And, the prospectus really goes to great lengths to address this.
Okay.
They emphasize the role of the National Rivers Authority, the NRA, in setting and enforcing those environmental standards.
So the NRA was kind of like the watchdog, making sure Southwest Water wasn't polluting and kept the water safe.
Exactly. They were the enforcers, making sure everything was above board. And the prospectus makes it clear that they weren't messing around.
Okay, but here's the thing. Wasn't there already a problem with water quality in the region?
You're hitting on a key point here.
Like, wasn't that one of the reasons for privatizing in the first place, to get the money to fix those problems?
Right, but it's a bit more complicated than that. The prospectus does admit that meeting those pristine water quality standards wasn't going to be a walk in the park, especially with some of the older infrastructure they inherited.
So they're basically acknowledging that there were already problems before privatization. Wouldn't that make potential investors a little nervous?
You'd think so, right?
Like, hey, we're giving you all this money, but you haven't even sorted out the basics yet.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, the document actually details instances where Southwest Water had been granted these relaxations or entered into what they called Section 20 undertakings with the government.
Okay, so what does that mean in plain English?
Basically, it means they were admitting that they weren't meeting certain standards at the time of privatization.
So they're saying, we know we're polluting, but trust us, we'll fix it.
Well, they phrase it a bit more diplomatically, of course.
Of course.
But they do talk about things like lead levels exceeding limits in some areas, pesticide contamination from farming runoff, and treatment works that were struggling to handle the volume.
Wow, so they're admitting to polluting and not meeting basic safety standards, and they still expect people to buy shares.
It's a bold strategy, let's put it that way. Their argument is essentially, we inherited this mess, but we're the ones to fix it. They really emphasize that massive investment program, how it's going to modernize those outdated systems and bring them into compliance.
Right, but they're also saying it's going to take time and a lot of money.
Exactly.
It sounds like a bit of a gamble.
It does, doesn't it?
They're promising a cleaner future while admitting they're currently falling short, so did anyone buy it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And all this talk about balancing act and promises, it really comes into focus when we look at the Lowermore incident.
Ah, yes, the Lowermore incident. That was a pretty major water contamination event, wasn't it? Didn't that happen right before this prospectus was published?
It did. Just a year before, in 1988,
Okay.
aluminium sulfate, a chemical used to treat water.
Yeah.
Well, it was accidentally mixed into the water supply at the Lowermore treatment works.
Accidentally. How does that even happen?
It seems like there was a failure in the dosing system, and to make matters worse, the works were unmanned at the time.
What? Unmanned?
Yeah, so it took hours for anyone to even realize what was happening. People were drinking contaminated water, reporting skin rashes, hair discoloration, gastrointestinal issues.
Oh, that's
It
awful.
was a complete nightmare.
So how do they address this massive PR disaster in a document that's supposed to attract investors? Did they try to sweep it under the rug?
Surprisingly, no.
Really?
They actually dedicate a whole section to it.
Wow.
They talk about the investigation by a health advisory group, the legal fallout, but there's also this clear attempt to control the narrative.
What do you mean?
Well, they highlight the conclusion that the symptoms were mostly mild and short-lived,
Okay,
downplaying the long-term health concerns.
I see.
They also talk about accepting liability for damages and meeting customer claims. It's almost as if they're trying to contain the damage, reassuring investors that this was a one-off incident, not a sign of things to come.
Damage Control 101.
Exactly. But, this wasn't just bad press. There were actual lawsuits and prosecutions, too.
Right.
And the prospectus does acknowledge the civil claims and mentions private prosecutions started by an anglers association worried about the impact on fish populations.
Makes sense.
But here's a crucial detail. The prospectus states that under the new Water Act, any criminal liability of the old water authority wouldn't transfer to the newly privatized company.
So they get a clean slate legally as well as financially.
It does seem a bit convenient, doesn't it?
It does. They're acknowledging the incident, but kind of distancing themselves from any real accountability. Didn't this raise concerns about how seriously they'd take safety and environmental protection once they were a private entity?
You'd think so, right? But remember, this is a sales pitch, not a confession.
Oh, right.
They're walking a tightrope trying to reassure investors while being transparent, at least to a certain degree.
Okay, so we've got this whole mix of things going on, financial maneuvering, environmental concerns, a major PR crisis. Sounds like a pretty risky investment.
It does a bit, yeah.
So those diversification strategies we were talking about earlier, the leisure and property development and the tech ventures, were those supposed to offset some of those risks?
That's an excellent question. It's almost as if they're saying, don't worry about these little hiccups. We've got exciting new revenue streams on the horizon.
Right.
So let's delve into those next and see if their vision for a diversified Southwest Water actually held water.
Okay, so we've got this picture of Southwest Water, ambitious plans, a few skeletons in the closet, and a whole lot of promises. Let's talk about those diversification strategies. Were they just a distraction, or did they have a real shot at success?
Well, it's interesting to see how they try to leverage what they already had, like those reservoirs.
Yeah.
They weren't just for storing water, they were prime locations for recreational development.
So turning essential resources into moneymakers. Classic. But did they even have experience with things like tourism and leisure?
That's the thing. They talk about expanding existing facilities, creating new ones, fishing, sailing, maybe even windsurfing.
Sounds fun.
Right. But whether they had the know-how to pull it off is another question.
It does seem a bit risky. Running a water company is one thing, but creating a tourist destination is a whole different animal. What about those property development plans? Did they have more experience there?
Well, they mentioned this joint venture with a private developer to build office space in Exeter, near their headquarters.
Okay.
So it does suggest they were trying to attract businesses to the region, be more than just a utility company, more like a partner in boosting the economy.
I see. So maybe they saw an opportunity to capitalize on all that growth they were predicting. More people, more businesses, more demand for their services. Makes sense. What about those scientific and technical services? Were they seriously trying to become a tech company too?
It's really fascinating, this document. They highlight their development of new process control instruments. They even had patents pending.
No way.
Yeah, it's like they wanted to show they were innovators, not just some boring old water company.
So they're selling this vision of a company that's ready for anything. But looking back, did any of it actually work? Did Southwest Water become this multifaceted powerhouse they were dreaming of?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? This prospectus is just a snapshot, a glimpse into what they were thinking and hoping for at the dawn of privatization.
Right.
Whether they actually pulled it off is a story for another time, another deep dive. But I think this document gives us a really valuable starting point, a way to understand what shaped not just Southwest Water, but the whole British water industry.
Yeah, it's like we've been on an archaeological dig unearthing all these layers of history buried in this prospectus. We've seen the financial maneuvering, the environmental worries, the PR nightmares, and those big plans for the future. It's a good reminder that even something as basic as water can be affected by the whims of politics and the economy.
Absolutely. And it really gets you thinking about those big questions. What happens when we hand over essential services to private companies? Do they put profits before people? Are they held accountable? And does privatization really deliver what it promises?
Those are questions we're still wrestling with today, not just in Britain, but all over the world. So next time you turn on your tap, take a second to think about the journey that water took to get there. A journey shaped by history, politics, and, yeah, maybe even a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit.
Well said. Keep those questions flowing, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.